Thank you so much, and thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm very much a fan of being anywhere north. So please excuse me, as you can hear, my voice is a little bit lower than usual. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research for about sort of 45 minutes. I'm looking forward to a little bit of discussion with you as well. So I'd like to weave an argument for you in 3 acts with 2 interludes. Prologue. What happens if we consider this an energy future 5,000 years from now? You see a woman in black standing beside a stone, stories, knowings ground down to silicon bits inside. She appears to stand on the surface of a churning loch, waves lapping over her feet. In one hand, she holds a flint disc, the blade a dark arc against the sky. She is whispering something. She turns to the stone that is not a stone. She reaches up and slits it open, down to its socket in the sea. Clear liquid wells from the cut, begins to drip slow like jelly into the salt water. You see the woman dip her finger. She tastes what is within. Stories, knowings, ground down to silicon bits, now oozing out. The standing stone that is not a stone darkens. Those words are both a speculative fabulation and a provocation. That does not sound like an empirical argument, you might be thinking. But it is both empirical and urgent, as I'd like to share with you. In many places, the energy future seems riven between techno-fixed utopias and techno-condemned dystopias. Too often, we are offered a binary, either or. Either technology will save the day, a future that erases the research and engineering labours, the funding and political commitments, and all the social and technical relations that are needed. Or the future is apocalyptic, a drowned world, a suffocating world in which our actions are too little and too late. Along with future-making scholars such as Donna Haraway, I find these binary futures too escapist. Both give our future-making power away to leave the trouble untouched. I choose neither to hope someone else will fix the future, nor to despair and just await the end. Instead, along with many of my colleagues, I choose to stay with the trouble, which means staying in the troubling present. It means working with empirical and ethical care in collaborations with those around me to make our future otherwise. As a colleague in my ethnographic field site said, you can only get at the people you can get at. So with those people, and the more than people who I can get at in my field site, I've been trying to develop an empirical toolkit for making energy futures for the next 5,000 years. Act 1, Enduring Nature Cultures. Looming over you is a monolith 3 or 4 times your own height. Your camera lens turns it into a silhouette, smooth and regular, and as incomprehensible as that famous anomaly from 2001, A Space Odyssey. Like the ape and the astronaut, you reach out to this massive stone that stands in the shadowed grass. Beneath your fingers, mica glitters in the winter-white sun. The surface is not black, but gritty, with neon-coloured lichen, rough under your skin, its edges sharp and regular. Looking up, the top is not horizontal, but an angle so precise it appears laser cut. This stone is one of 3 monoliths standing on a raise of dome grass, half surrounded by the silver light of 2 lochs. This is the Stones of Stennis, a Neolithic stone circle assembled around 5,000 years ago. Between the standing stones over low hills on the horizon, you can see the great blades of wind turbines turning like blown dandelions. In the fields below, you can see their scattered seals, micro wind turbines, spinning beside stone croft buildings. For a moment, on the road between you and the loch, an electric car rolls past almost as silent as an apparition. Welcome to the islands of Orkney, off the northeast coast of Scotland, and this is my ethnographic field site for the past decade. Here, I've been collaborating with the islanders to understand and support their energy futures, from wind energy to electric cars and far more. Stone, silicon, and metal technologies coexist in this working landscape. The prehistoric monument's future is entangled with the island's renewable energy future, with its turbines and grid electricity cables. Both monument and turbines and energy futures have to be done together to endure. A local writer and shopkeeper explained the importance of this entanglement between ancient and contemporary technology. He said to me, "Out of my window in Stennes, there's a Bronze Age village unexcavated in the field. Across the road is the farm of Erland, which used to be called the Boo, so it's got Viking roots. And then on the shores to the right is an Iron Age broch, and behind it was a Neolithic standing stone until the farmer knocked it down. So it informs the decisions you make. It's like being part of a long set of beads that stretches thousands of years into the past. Then you're just a dot, part of it. And it influences how you think about the future." People in Orkney have been making technology for 5,000 years, from arrowheads and stone circles to whiskey and tide energy machines. You can see all these ages no matter where you look: stone, bronze, iron, Viking, silicon, however you count your time. This is time that you can see and touch in the landscape. The monuments and artifacts scattered over the fields on every island in the archipelago. You can experience 5 millennia as a continuum of human technology and habitation. As anthropologist Tim Ingold has explained, time is in the landscape. You make the world and what you know from your movement through and engagement with your landscape and its archaeology. And that temporal record can be thousands of years or a minute old. In Orkney, as you move, you experience a world where you're just a dot on a 5,000-year-old string. The stones of Stennes are being preserved for the future through heritage planning and other legal protection. Both past and long future are therefore embodied and standing upright in the grass. The shopkeeper's string is not metaphorical, but tangible, as a string of stones stretching 5,000 years behind, and therefore can be imagined 5,000 years ahead. 10,000 years of human experience can be touched. Time in which you are just a few breaths and whose end is not coming soon. In Orkney, you live, work and dream in a deep time zone. The person who best articulates this deep island time is Orkney poet George Mackay Brown. What I've just said in very long paragraphs, he encapsulated in this: "The Orkney imagination is haunted by time. Both past and future appear as ghosts of possibility that you can see and touch in the islands." But this deep time does not leave the islands stuck in the past. In contrast to a common mythology that rural areas are slow to change, the islands are actually ahead of many urban places. So they have around 8 large-scale community-owned wind turbines, over 700 locally owned micro-wind turbines, an electric car network, all operating on their decade-old smart grid. And I've not even reached the bit in my story where I'm going to tell you about the wave and tide energy machines. As a result of all this energy activity, the islands generate over 130% of their electricity needs from their landscape, from the winds, waves and tides, exporting their renewable energy south to the rest of the country. As the local member for the Scottish Parliament points out, it means they're hitting the UK government target well ahead of the 2020 deadline to be 100% self-sufficient. Orkney shows what living beyond this 2020 deadline can be. And the point is that it can be. The islands are already there. The sustainable future is doable in all its imperfection. Orkney is the living embodiment of a high-carbon future described by the UK government in this report. This is what the UK government says about the future. A high-carbon world is one with more extreme weather, where we and our children are faced with the costs of adapting the way we live and the infrastructure and systems that support us. We must face up to these challenges and make the necessary investment to move to a low-carbon economy now. But this is not the future. This is the Orkney present. When the official Lifeline ferry stops sailing for a few days due to a storm, which might be regarded as extreme weather in other places, the islands are cut off. But there's no panic, no drama, no zombies. Islanders have long adapted to living in a world where the lights and the phones go out for hours at a time and you can't travel off the island for a day or two. They just reach into the chest freezer and potato sacks and pop round to the neighbour, check they're okay. They've faced up to it and are already meeting the challenge of adapting their energy infrastructure. They are investing in their own, more resilient, low-carbon energy system, the electric cars, the micro-wind turbines and the rest. The world the government describes is not a prediction. It's their present. If you want to live in that future, go and live in Orkney. This shouldn't be surprising. It may not be surprising to many of you, actually. Islands around the world have long understood themselves as future-making places. Islands and edge locations are often on the planetary front line of environmental change. Their long shorelines and specialized ecosystems are finely tuned and sensitive places, barometers for the rest of the Earth. They are advanced indicators or extreme reproductions of what is future elsewhere, as Godfrey Baldacchino, island studies scholar, has said. Islands are the harbingers, the pioneers, the miner's canary. What happens at the edge is often the litmus test for the urban future. People in Orkney are very aware of their own frontline fragility. Some of the smaller islands only have about 60 or so people living on them, and their depopulation means an end to that entire island society. It could happen in a generation. There are already haunted islands on the horizon, with derelict houses, peeling red phone boxes, cold kettles still sitting on stoves. And that future, a complicated entanglement of social environmental issues, is one the islanders have to work hard to resist. In Orkney, a sustainable future is not an armchair debate. It's an imperative. It's a matter of island survival. No time to dither. The future must be a sustainable present, or children and grandchildren will only be able to visit home as a ruin. This is not a commitment to an unchanging future, but to making a thriving one at best and a precarious one in which they are at least still there at worst. There is no talk about ending. In contrast to Anthropocene apocalypse stories, the world will not end in Orkney. They live on that long string of time. Many feel embedded in the place. They know and need the place in their bones. An ecologist and singer expressed this quiet determination to remain when she said to me, "This place will always have a future because some folk will never leave. They feel they have no choice about where they could live. This is their home. They could never leave." Orkney is a home to a going-on togetherness of humans and habitation, hills and heather, creatures and critters, infrastructures and islands, a natural cultural togetherness that understands its shared future, enduring for another 5,000 years. Interlude. Uncanny tale. Orkney is an uncanny tale I heard as I sat with friends before a fire, hemmed in by whiskey and cats. It was Hogmanay, New Year's Eve, and this friend was wandering the dark lanes of Stromness, a small town in Orkney, visiting homes, sharing a drink with folk, as you do on Hogmanay in Scotland. He'd had a drink or two and was getting into the wee hours of the morning, and he can't quite remember how it happened, but he remembers walking up a lane between some houses and finding a door. So he went in, and sitting in the front room before a fire were two old men. The two old men had very large ears, he definitely remembers that, and the three of them talked together in, soft voices about the meaning of the world, Deep words were exchanged. He really wishes he could remember what they were. And then he must have left and gone home, and they can't for the life of him remember how. But what's really weird is that although he grew up in Stromness, he has never been able to find that lane or that door since. A few weeks later, I was in a local shop chatting to the owner who said to me, "People don't die in Orkney. They go to live up some forgotten lane in Stromness." The uncanny and irrational has long been legitimised as knowledge in anthropology. A good ethnographer does not dismiss local knowledge and indigenous ontology in ways of making the world. As an ethical empirical researcher, if I'm told there's spirits in the world, then there are real spirits, not made-up ones. But I work in Scotland with Scottish scientists and farmers, and no one's telling me that the dead really live in Stromness. But there are strange stories. The uncanny lives just there in the corner of your eye. Orkney is an uncanny tale, and it's telling you something. Act 2, Electric Nature Cultures. Electricity is often taken to be ephemeral and invisible, with sensorial subtlety, as Mike Anousis and Tim Ingold argue. But electricity is easy to generate as a sensory experience. Electrical charge is everywhere to see and touch. Electrons are elementary particles that constitute all materials, after all, and their movement and transformation into light is common. Take a plastic ruler, rub it with a dry cloth, and you can pick up hair and tissues. You've just made an electrostatic charge. Electron comes from the Greek for amber, the fossilized resin long known for this electrostatic property. And open an envelope by pulling apart the glued surfaces, and in a dark room, you can see the sudden blue-green phosphorescence as the bonds break, and electrons are excited. It's quite good with bank statements and irritating things like that. So electricity is not ethereal or uncanny exactly, but constitutes and interacts with the material world. It's not a material semiotic, because it doesn't have any mass, but it's an electro-semiotic. You can see it and make sense of it. Electricity is tricksy to think with, though. It's a phenomenon entangled in the conductive property of materials and the electric charge of electrons and ions. And although often talked about as a flow of current, nothing actually flows. And electrical engineers prefer to think of in terms of a potential difference over the length of a cable, energy rising and falling in an uneven long geography of resistance. In social sciences and anthropology, there's been much recent thinking about electricity. We have Dominic Boyers thinking about the anthropology electric, Timothy Mitchell talking about carbon democracy, entangling fossil fuel electricity production in wider energy politics. And many people have been questioning the relationship between electricity generation and consumption, and how that's entangled in carbon and democracy. Electricity, therefore, carries with it politics and knowledges, as well as charge. It's an electro-semiotic, as I said. This means that electricity, with its politics, is participant in making energy futures. Some ways, and not others. We always have to ask, whose electric future do we imagine and make? And what are the potential differences in its locations? In Orkney, I've been led to think about these potential differences along the length of the undersea cables, and one particular undersea cable between the islands and mainland Scotland. And this, when I talk about potential difference, I mean this double sense of both electrical voltage and political difference. So I invite you to walk with me, taking the ferry over to a high island of YHYS, walk across the peat between the two great big hills there until they open towards the sea on the far side and down to a pebble beach. And slithering amongst these great big pebbles the size of dragon eggs, there is a great rusting pipe. And within this pipe, there are an import and export cable, two 20-megawatt cables, and this is all that connects the Orkney smart grid to the Scottish mainland grid. This cable is a huge bottleneck. I told you that the islands were generating 130% renewable energy generated by their rich weather, and that means that all the excess energy that's generated has to go down that cable. I like to imagine it feels warm from too many renewable Orkney electrons being generated on the grid. You can feel Orkney electrons in the sheer cold wind that turns on the locally owned wind turbines. And the frequent storms are hard on the suspended electricity cables that hang from the poles over the island fields. And one of the constraints on the grid is the capacity both of the cable here and the capacity hanging on all the poles, because what happens is that when there's too many electrons being generated, the electricity cables get too warm and they start to sag. And that's a serious issue, which they have to make sure doesn't happen. So due to all these grid capacity problems, the energy operators installed an active network management system. It's the first in the UK. And these are smarts in the electricity network, which balance the generation and with consumption. They do that by switching off generators. They switch off the wind turbines when the load is too high to stop the grid from melting, literally. And that's a process that's called curtailment. This is not the simple techno-fix solution it appears to be, however. The community-owned wind turbines, like this one, are generating revenue for the islands from the feed-in tariff, and that income is the basis by which the islands borrowed money from the bank to pay for these turbines. When the turbines are switched off, the islands lose desperately needed income to improve their fragile lands, from home insulation to pier facilities. Some Orkney community wind turbines are curtailed over 40% of the time. It's a staggering loss of income to islands that struggle with the highest levels of fuel poverty in the UK. 30% of the households in the island use more than a fifth of their income to pay for fuel. Wind turbines are not just technical objects, they are socio-technical and environmental infrastructures. Electrons do not simply flow from these devices standing monumental in the landscape. Natural wind energy is transduced into electrical energy, and the electricity is transmitted in cables through the landscape. Through wind turbine, electrons become part of grid politics and capacities, and part of the people in the place. Turbines are not just technical infrastructures, they are natural, cultural, electric. This may be familiar to some of you from Ashley Carter's work, who has persuasively shown how the Panama Canal and its watershed are managed together, creating a natural cultural infrastructure. Wind turbines and similar electrical infrastructures also overflow technical boundaries. They are quite literally connected to the landscape through the wind and are inseparable from not just the local politics in place, but also grid politics in place. As Susan Lee Starr long ago noted, one of the characteristics of infrastructure is their reach or scope. Given all this understanding, what can the islanders actually do to deal with the grid curtailment issue? As the chair of the Orkney Renewable Energy Forum said to me, what can we do? And he gave 3 very specific solutions. 1, we can use more power in the islands to increase the capacity of the grid. 2, put another wire in at Rackwick, so put another cable across to the mainland. 3, take the power off on another fuel. So number 2, bit out of the question. They don't have the financial resources to pay to upgrade the great big rusting pipe and cable on Rackwick. But 1, use more power, increase capacity on the grid. That they can do. You saw it earlier. Electric cars. The islands converted their first electric car 13 years ago and now have more electric cars per person than anywhere else in the country, I'm told. The Islands Council has invested in electric car charging points and public car parks, which are free to use, and those with micro wind turbines are more or less running their electric cars for free from their fast-moving air. Option 3, we take the power off in another fuel. That means energy storage. And that also means electric cars again. Outside the smart grid and the active management system, and beyond the reach of the energy operator, electric cars are, in essence, islander-run grid batteries on wheels. So a recent project has also installed some Tesla Powerwall home batteries in new affordable homes in the islands, which are similar scale lithium batteries, but just without the wheels. Perhaps more excitingly, the island's communities invested in hydrogen storage. The Orkney Surf and Turf project involves taking the curtailed electricity from the ED wind turbine, which would otherwise be lost, and along with tide energy, which I'll tell you about in a moment, they're going to turn that all, they are turning it all, into hydrogen fuel in canisters that are then shipped to where they're needed elsewhere in the islands. And along with a second hydrogen electrolyser and a proposed hydrogen fuel ferry, the islands have become an EU hydrogen territory. The electricity grid does not stop at the wall in Orkney homes. Electricity transmission is not ethereal. In Orkney, electricity is visible in the islanders' everyday lives and practice. The islanders and their grid are entangled together. This makes all the differences and the potential differences visible and therefore malleable. By that, I mean that the grid curtailment problem is not limited to the usual electricity transmission actors. The grid curtailment problem is not limited to just state regulators, multinational companies and operators. Instead, the entanglement between electricity grid and islanders means the islanders can actually have some kind of purchase on their grids. The Orkney grid is situated, drawing on Donna Haraway, as much as the community wind turbines. The islanders can thus get at the grid, pull on the threads that constitute it, and therefore make their energy future otherwise. In essence, the fabric of the electricity grid has a basic warp, the lines of the electricity cables and transmission network controlled by the operator. But the islanders have woven around this with their hydrogen networks, their electric cars, creating a kind of weft of locally owned alternative fuels and self-determined capacity generation. What was originally designed, the centralized grid with power radiating outwards from central control, the islanders have reshaped into their own distributed, decentralized energy tapestry. That such reweaving of the grid is happening here at the edge should not be surprising. Of course, I mean edge in the double sense of the cutting edge in technology terms and marginal edge in geography terms, because that's what the extended literature on innovation shows. That's where it happens. Despite the pervasive story that innovation always happens or has to happen in clustering and smart cities, innovation at the edge has been long well documented. As Philip Vanini has said, along with Jonathan Taggart, an islander assembles together an island by way of making use of whatever is to hand. Islands and other edge locations are places where people improvise. They work with what they have to hand and innovate using that in practical ad hoc solutions to similar problems, such as maintaining the grid and dealing with precarious grid infrastructure. Being at the edge is where you can experiment, and you often have to. It's where you can make your natural cultural electric future working with and reweaving what and who you have to work with. You get at who you can get at. Interlude. Agency tale. Orkney was formed from giant teeth, it is said, it is known. They were spat out into the ocean by the Mester Stoorworm, a vast monster, head the size of a mountain, dragon scales like satellite dishes. The Stoorworm was slain by a kind of transgender Cinderella with an attitude problem, known locally as Azipattle. He set a daring peat fire in the belly of the monster, which burned the worth to death. In its fiery death throes, as the ocean thrashed in white foam, the monster bellowed, and its teeth fell out and formed Orkney. And the monster bellowed again, and more teeth fell, forming Shetland, the islands to the north. And with a final shudder, the rest of the teeth dropped from the vast head and made the Faroe Islands, the Danish islands just north of there. And as the dying monster collapsed, still smoking within a fire, it coiled into a huge, hulking mass in the sea and became volcanic Iceland. Folktale. So Orkney is a place that's made from more than geology. Its flagstones were formed from more than Lake Orcadie in the Devonian age. It's about 400 million years ago. The flagstones in Orkney are like dental plaque on the Stoorworm's sharp cliff-edged teeth. Orkney still roars in a storm. The Stoorworm is instilled in the island's stone bones, which are now built into roads and homes and monuments and stone circles. The stoorworm touches those who live there. Sometimes its teeth graze the skin, draw blood, and the islands enter in. I cannot produce an empirical account of the Mester stoorworm, nor the power of any place woven from both geology and great myth. Orkney is a vivid tapestry worked on over many centuries, said the poet George Mackay Brown. He was adamant that it is impossible to understand Orkney in any prosaic way. This indescribable Orkney is not a backdrop, a context, or a landscape. It has an energy that can never be harnessed as some environmental resource. This Orkney is the air. It is in the air. Breathe it in. Orkney is a place that acts through people, I was told by an engineer in the islands. In these words, I heard Orkney as a symbiosis within, not environmental determinism without. Orkney is a people-place relation that acts. The air gets into you, the stoorworm still bites. Nobody forgets a visit to these mythic islands. They return with stories and sometimes with something more in their blood or under their skin. My final act, NatureCultureElectric Futures. The problems of the world cannot possibly be solved by skeptics or cynics whose horizons are limited by the obvious realities. We need people who can dream of things that never were. This quotation is hand-painted in its calligraphy over the entrance to the European Marine Energy Centre. This is the world's largest and longest-running test site for wave and tide energy devices. The letters are painted on the magnolia wall at the top of a chill, creaking staircase in an old stone schoolhouse in Orkney. The words are a knowing invocation of that grand call to go to the moon, remade as a call to go to the waves, a call to seek that other companion body, the ocean, another alien environment that has seas that cannot be tamed like the moon and its mares. Neil Kermode, director of EMEC, said to me, I've always said that the marine energy sector should be our Apollo program in the world, enabling us to sell product around the world for years to come and to give us a sustainable energy future. He was continuing to compare the development of the marine energy industry to the development of the space industry. Both are struggles to develop a new technology that can withstand a hostile environment deleterious to human life. As with the space industry, there's considerable interest in this technological endeavour. One estimate suggests there are around 400 high-profile visitors to EMEC each year, from international journalists and television crews to government ministers and venture capitalists. The communications manager at EMEC explained to me how important it is for these visitors to see marine energy in Orkney. She said, they see marine renewables as real. They see devices in the water, the power of the tides and waves. They see real people working in the sector. Orkney is where people come to touch some monumental tide or wave energy machine or stand beside the ocean of future time where the on-grid devices are tested at sea. Often they start their tour under the blue calligraphy that hails marine energy as a grand endeavour, a la Apollo programme, as Neil suggests. But the words aren't painted within a gleaming glass building with tinted windows, hipster cafes and a lawn. The words are painted here in Stromness, on the top floor of an old island schoolhouse, on the stormy edge of the British Isles, about as far from the working environment of NASA as you could possibly get. Neil Kermode, head of EMEC, put it to me in this way in 2008, when it was even smaller than the EMEC is today. He said, they all come here to Orkney, they think it's happening here, and they're a bit surprised at the old school and 9 people. There was a Canadian guy in fisheries who said, we only have 10,000 people. And I said, oh, we have 10 almost. So how is it possible that 10 people, now around 25, can achieve so much? How is it that this little organisation acts, and it does act, like mission control for a global marine energy industry? EMEC remains the largest grid-connected test site with berths for 5-wave and 8 tide energy prototypes to plug in and gain accreditation for electricity. Theirs is the important gold standard in the sector that shows a device can operate on the grid. And just to give you some comparable numbers, I saw a chart in 2012 that said that EMEC had worked with about 45, this is in 2012, different marine energy developers, whereas across the entirety of the US, the test sites there combined had only worked with 17 developers in total. As Neil Kermode said to me on several occasions, everyone looks to us, looks here. If it weren't for us, it would just be a few odd people with a device on a beach. We have a responsibility to create an industry. If EMEC loses 4 or 5 marine energy developers, well, that's maybe 50% of the world's projects. All this should begin to give you a sense of the scale of the challenge. It's not just the technical problems. The success of this industry, of marine energy, rests upon what happens in these islands at the edge and their entanglement with the electricity grid. For some of you, it might seem a paradox. Global innovation at the island edge? How does this handful of people, based on the top floor of an old island school building, hold together as a global energy industry? The contrast between EMEC and NASA in terms of resources couldn't be more stark. Some of you might be thinking this is stretching credulity. The simple answer is in the view through Neil's office windows from the schoolhouse, out across Orkney. EMEC does not try and do this, and cannot do so alone. EMEC is part of the 21,000 populated people in Orkney, a place that is not just a romantic or mythic landscape, not just a technical landscape, a place that is natural, cultural, and electric, and a place that acts. This is a place that kicks back, as Karen Barad might say. The Orkney Marine Renewables website provides a real guide to the scale of marine energy mission control. It lists 30 island companies in the supply chain, including sea surveys, sonar devices, onshore workers, environmental consultancies. Overall, there are 300 people and jobs related to the marine energy sector in Orkney. This is a living industry operating at a scale that's unprecedented in the world. There are 300 people making marine energy futures, not a few people with a device on a beach. Marine mission control is not just EMEC on the top floor of an old school building. It spreads out over the islands, reaching through the grid cables, through the seas and lochs, through the people who work with wave and tide devices. It's woven into the energy tapestry. It's woven into Orkney, woven in to the people-place relation that acts. This is not some theoretical turn. I'm talking about 300 people going on together, figuring out how to do this, working with the barnacles, with the limpets, which grow on the turbine blades, working with the community wind turbines, EMEC's involved in the hydrogen electrolyzer projects, and working together to make a new energy future. Perhaps the fact that EMEC is part of Orkney, woven into this place in this way, perhaps that's why there even is a mission control for marine energy in the world. Being in Orkney means that the future for marine energy is on that long string of time. It's on that string that reaches 5,000 years into the future. The long future for the islands and a long future for marine energy are being done together. Both islands and marine energy are being imagined and made to endure together. Epilogue. You see a woman in black beside a standing stone, stories, knowings, ground down to silicon bits inside. She appears to stand on the surface of a churning loch, waves lapping over her feet. That is how I began my speculative future for an Orkney 5,000 years hence. I wrote it as a provocation, not a prediction. I am interested in the practice of future making, that is, in how we imagine and make the future, and energy futures in particular. And writing is performative. What we write makes futures more and less thinkable, and therefore more and less possible. I wrote it because, as I hope I have shown, Orkney lives in a deep time zone. It is a monumental and mythic landscape whose uncanny imaginary impossibility extends 5 millennia into the future. The islands make it possible to inhabit and touch that time, to stay with the trouble in the present, in order to ask questions about life and living 5,000 years in the future. Orkney is a natural cultural landscape suffused with a visible electric infrastructure, participant in everyday life. In these islands, energy futures are imagined with an understanding that the natural place is inseparable from the cultural, from people and their politics, and also inseparable from the electric power that propels their local improvisations to address grid curtailment and fuel poverty. These islands are, as with so many places often thought of as remote, both at the geographic edge and at the precarious cutting edge. Here, energy worlds can be tinkered with, the heterogeneous and multi-species parts artfully integrated, as Lucy Suchment might say, to make new futures possible. By moving beyond thinking of places as just natural cultural to places as natural, cultural and electric, I wonder if we can participate more fully in going on together in diverse, vibrant and more enduring energy futures, as Orkney has done. So I wrote my provocation to raise that question for places that are not Orkney. What and whose stories can you tell of your natural, cultural, electric world 2, 5, 10,000 years hence? You see the woman dip her finger. She tastes what is within the stone. Stories, knowings, ground down to silicon bits, now oozing out. The standing stone that is not a stone darkens. In the seawater at the woman's feet, a shard of light reaches out, linking to the horizon and on to a far distant shore. Thank you.